When European powers claimed East Africa in the 1890s, they lacked the resources to actually govern it. They had to manage millions of people across vast territories with almost no European manpower, virtually zero financial budget, and a total lack of local language fluency. To bridge this gap, the colonizers devised two very different solutions. To the west, the British implemented indirect rule in Uganda. To the east, the Germans applied direct rule in Tanganyika. These distinct administrative approaches were calculated responses to the specific African societies the Europeans encountered on the ground. While both strategies shared the same goal, extracting local wealth and controlling the population, their different methods laid down political fault lines that still shape East African governance today. Indirect rule was a system where the colonial administration used existing traditional local leaders to govern on their behalf, as seen in this photograph.
British administrators, like Captain F.D. Leaguard pictured here, championed this method because it was practical. Paying local chiefs from local taxes was cheaper than importing European officials, and it immediately solved their shortage of personnel. This organizational flowchart shows how they adapted local systems. The British targeted pre-existing centralized kingdoms like Buganda and hijacked their government structure. British governors and district commissioners sat at the top, issuing orders to the Kabaka, who passed them down a rigid hierarchy to the local Saza, Gombolola, and Maluka chiefs. The mechanics were straightforward. Commands flowed downward from the British officials. In return, extracted resources, specifically taxes and cash crops like cotton, flowed upward from the African population. It is a common misconception that the African kings kept their power. They lost their sovereignty. If a local leader disobeyed a British order, they were instantly deposed or exiled and replaced by someone who would comply. This structure functioned as a psychological buffer. Because the British remained hidden from daily view, local farmers forced to pay taxes or perform hard labor directed their anger at their own chiefs, rather than the colonial administrators pulling the strings. By turning traditional leaders into the visible face of colonial oppression, indirect rule delayed unified mass rebellions against the British for decades. In Tanganyika, the Germans took the opposite approach. Direct rule bypassed traditional African leaders in favor of an entirely foreign administration. The primary reason for this was social structure. Unlike the centralized kingdoms of Uganda, many societies in Tanganyika were highly decentralized. There were no powerful central kings for the Germans to co-opt into a hierarchy. Without a local command structure to use, the Germans brought in outsiders. They appointed coastal Arab and Swahili men, known as Akitas and Jumbes, seen in this historical photograph, to enforce colonial laws and collect taxes. The Germans also operated with a strict military hierarchy, viewing African political systems as primitive. Furthermore, they feared that leaving traditional kings in power would provide the local population with a rallying point to organize revolts. Let's test this logic. Imagine you are an administrator in 1895, facing a decentralized society with no central king. Why would indirect rule be physically impossible to implement? Take a few seconds to think it through. Without a central figure to issue orders through, there is no existing structure to control the population. You are forced to bring in your own officials. Direct rule was a brute force solution that was expensive to maintain and created constant cultural friction with the local populations. These two systems generated radically different reactions. In Tanzania, the visible presence of foreign Akitas sparked immediate uprisings, like the Maji Maji Rebellion. In Uganda, the British practice of favoring certain groups to enforce their rule bred long-term internal ethnic divisions. Yet, despite their different administrative styles, the economic reality for Africans was identical. In both regions, local populations lost their independence, were forced into a cash economy through heavy taxation, and were subjected to mandatory labor to build colonial infrastructure. Let's summarize the differences on this comparison matrix. Under indirect rule, the British used local leaders, preserved some local culture, and kept costs low. Under direct rule, the Germans used foreign Akitas, ignored local culture, and spent heavily on administration. Neither system was designed for the benefit of Africans. They were simply different logistical tools applied to solve the same problem, the maximum economic exploitation of African land and labor. The echoes of these choices are still loud today.
When a Ugandan citizen interacts with their modern local council chairperson or registers a document with a parish chief, they are participating in the modern evolution of the very administrative hierarchy the British designed over a century ago.